Okay, let's dive in. We're tackling some really complex, maybe even frustrating territory today. You know, the kind of issues in our world that seem to involve, well, everything at once.
Hmm.
Stuff where science butts heads with politics,
Hmm.
nature seems completely tangled up with technology, society and the environment are inseparable. How do you even start thinking clearly about something like, say, climate change or a pandemic? It feels like our categories just collapse.
Exactly. It's like we have these neat mental boxes, right? Nature over here, society over there, science, politics.
Yeah.
And then these real world problems come along, and they're clearly a messy mix of all of them. And
Yeah.
our usual ways of understanding, they just short circuit.
So for this challenge, our guide is the work of Bruno Latour, specifically his book, We Have Never Been Modern.
That's right. A really thought provoking book. We're drawing on excerpts from it to help us navigate this.
And our mission in this deep dive using this source material is to really unpack Latour's central argument, which is maybe a bit counterintuitive. He's challenging our whole idea of what modernity even means.
He is, and
Yeah.
how we approach these messy issues because of it.
It feels like quite an academic exploration we're embarking on, but one with pretty big implications for how we see things right now, critically engaging with these ideas.
Definitely. And Latour sets the scene brilliantly right at the start. He asks you to just, sit down with a newspaper, look at the headlines.
Right. You see an article about the ozone layer.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds like chemistry, atmospheric science, pure nature, you'd think.
But then right next to it, maybe there's a report on international talks about CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons.
Ah, okay. So that's politics, treaties, global agreements. That feels like pure society.
And then maybe another piece about corporations pushing back on regulations. That's industry, economics, technology involved there.
And maybe scientists disagreeing. Like meteorologists have a different take than the chemists, or environmental groups clash with economists.
Yeah, exactly. Science hitting science, or different social interests conflicting.
And then maybe on another page, something like the early AIDS crisis in Paris he mentions.
Yeah.
That's, well, it's a virus biology, medical science.
But it's also public health policy, massive social stigma, political decisions about funding, cultural history. It's tangled up in everything.
Wow. Okay.
So Latour's point, looking at these everyday examples, is how all these things that seem so separate, the chemicals, the atmosphere, the negotiations, the money, the medical facts, the social reactions, they are all undeniably caught up in the same story. They just don't stay in their neat little boxes.
It really makes you feel how artificial those boxes can be when you bump up against reality.
Precisely. And that brings us right to the core problem Latour identifies, the real subject of our deep dive today. The world we actually live in is just teeming with these mixed up things, these entities that refuse to be just nature or just society.
Okay, and he has a name for them.
He calls them hybrids,
Yeah.
or sometimes quasi-objects.
Quasi-objects. Okay, what kind of things fall into that category? Give us some more examples.
Well, think about the ones from the source. The ozone layer isn't just a natural shield, right? It's defined by human pollution, the CFCs, and then human political action, the treaties trying to fix it.
Okay, so it's both natural and social.
And the AIDS virus, not just biology, it's deeply intertwined with social behaviors, political responses, how research gets funded, cultural stories.
The source mentions others too, like cryogenics blurring life and death, deforestation connecting economies to ecosystems.
Whale tracking collars, mixing tech, nature, conservation, the stock market influencing resource use, even religious fundamentalists using the internet.
It seems like almost everything complex is a hybrid then.
That's Latour's point. These mixtures are the norm, not the exception. And he argues that the defining feature of what we call modernity is this huge, almost desperate effort to deny this messy reality.
By trying to build walls.
Exactly, by trying to establish these rigid, impermeable walls between spheres. It's like modernity tries to solve this tangled Gordian knot by just cutting it, declaring, nature is separate from society, science is separate from politics.
So we create these theoretical firewalls between different domains.
Yes, we try to purify everything. Science is supposed to be about objective facts, out there in nature, untouched by society. Politics is about human will, social contracts. Art is subjective culture. Religion is belief, separate from facts. That's the modern project, right? Sorting everything into pure categories.
And what's the consequence of trying to force this separation?
Well, when we actually encounter these hybrids, which, again, Latour says make up the real world, we just don't have the right tools to think about them properly.
So new fields pop up. like science studies or environmental studies.
Right. Disciplines emerge to study these gray areas, but they often end up marginalized, sitting awkwardly between the big, established, pure fields. And the source notes Latour's critique of the standard critical stance. He argues it often relies on this very separation. It sets up a world split between objective things in themselves, nature, and subjective human representations or constructs, society. It misses the messy middle where the hybrids actually live.
It sounds like the tools we inherited are designed for a world that doesn't really exist, or at least not in the way we pretend it does.
Exactly. We operate with this framework of separation, and it makes the real hybrid world seem confusing, impossible to grasp, or forces us into simplistic choices.
Okay, so if that's the problem, this clash between a hybrid world and a modern mindset obsessed with purification, what does Latour argue is really going on? Beneath the surface, how have we actually been operating?
This is where he introduces his really core idea, the modern Constitution. And again, it's not like a political document you vote on. It's more like an underlying framework, a set of implicit rules and practices that define how modern societies actually work, often without acknowledging it.
And this constitution involves two key practices.
Two key practices working sort of in tension. The first one is purification. This is the public face, the part modernity proudly proclaims.
Right, the separating part.
Exactly. It's the work of creating and maintaining those pure domains we talked about. The pristine lab, free from social bias, the political assembly, making purely human decisions, separating nature from culture, facts from values. That's the official story. We separate things.
But you said there's tension, so there's a hidden part.
Absolutely. The second practice, the hidden engine, is what Latour calls translation, or sometimes mediation. This is the constant, messy, ongoing work of actually creating connections, networks, and mixtures between these supposedly separate domains.
So this is the mixing part.
Yes, it's the process where something natural, like a scientific discovery, gets translated into something social, like a new regulation or a technology, or how something social, like research funding or political pressure, shapes what happens in nature or in the lab.
So publicly we claim nature over here, society over there, but behind the scenes, all the real action involves mixing them up, letting them shape each other.
Precisely. And this, for Latour, based on the source material, is the fundamental issue. He calls it the asymmetry of the modern Constitution. Purification is the acknowledged public work. Translation, the creation of hybrids, is the hidden, unacknowledged work that actually makes the world go round.
So we pretend to be separatists, but we're actually master mixers.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And this denial, this refusal to acknowledge the constant work of translation, is why we're so bad at understanding and dealing with the hybrids that inevitably proliferate. We're trained to see only the pure categories and ignore the messy process that create and connect them.
That's a really striking idea. The problem isn't just the hybrids themselves, but our determined denial of how they come about.
It really is. And Latour doesn't just leave it as an abstract idea. He provides this incredibly detailed historical case study in the source material to show the modern Constitution purification and translation tangled together right from the beginnings of modern science and politics.
Okay, this is the story of Robert Boyle, Thomas Hobbes, and the air pump.
Yes, exactly. This is a fantastic academic example to really get hold of these concepts. Boyle, 17th century England, a key figure in the scientific revolution.
Trying to establish new ways of doing science, right, with experiments.
Yes. He was working with a new piece of technology, the air pump, trying to create a vacuum, an empty space, and crucially, establish the existence of this vacuum as a scientific fact, a matter of fact.
Okay, so how do you establish something like that as a fact back then? It couldn't just be having the pump work, could it?
No, absolutely not. And this is where Latour's analysis, drawn from the source, gets really interesting. Boyle realized that for the vacuum to become a widely accepted public scientific fact, it needed more than just the machine. It needed witnesses.
Human witnesses.
Yes. Credible gentlemen had to come into his laboratory, watch the experiment, see the effects of the vacuum, maybe a feather falling quickly, or famously, a bird collapsing inside the evacuated chamber. Their testimony was crucial.
Okay. So the non-human stuff, the pump, the vacuum, the poor bird, they're part of the experiment.
Yeah.
But you needed human agreement, social agreement, to certify the result as a fact.
Precisely. That's a perfect example of translation. A phenomenon from nature, the vacuum, wasn't just passively observed. It had to be established as a fact through a carefully managed social process. Testimony, agreement, the controlled setting of the lab. Nature was mediated, translated into a social reality.
And this is where Thomas Hobbes enters the picture,
Yeah.
the political philosopher, right? Famous for Leviathan.
Exactly. Hobbes was deeply concerned with establishing social order, figuring out how to have stable public truth in a time of civil war and religious strife. He saw what Boyle was doing in his lab, and his reaction wasn't just a scientific disagreement about whether vacuums exist, although he had scientific objections too.
His main objection was different.
Latour argues, based on the source, that Hobbes's core critique was fundamentally political and methodological. He basically said, look, these facts you're creating in private with a select group of your friends as witnesses. That's not how you establish public truth for a whole society.
Why not?
For Hobbes, public truth, the kind needed for political order, should come from the sovereign or maybe from open public reasoning, not from these closed-door experiments performed for a small, potentially biased group. He essentially accused Boyle of trying to create a rival source of authority, smuggling private laboratory agreements into the public sphere as indisputable facts, blurring the lines between science and politics.
Wow. So Hobbes actually saw the mixing, the translation that Boyle was doing, creating a scientific fact through social means, and he saw it as a political problem.
A threat, almost. Yes. Latour uses this dispute to show that the clean separation we now assume between science, discovering facts, and politics, making decisions, wasn't there at the start. The very foundations of modern science in Boyle's lab and modern political theory in Hobbes's work were grappling with the same hybrid problem. How do nature and society intertwine to produce reliable knowledge and stable order? This whole episode shows the struggle to perform purification while translation was happening all over the place, involving both humans and non-humans, like the air pump itself.
It really drives home that point from the source about non-humans not just being passive objects. The pump, the birds in the chamber,
Yeah.
they were active participants in making knowledge happen. They were like non-human witnesses.
Or actors, yeah. That's a key Latourian idea. It challenges our usual way of thinking science as just humans looking at a separate passive nature. No, the process of knowing, even back then, was a collective hybrid achievement involving humans and non-humans working together, or sometimes against each other.
Okay, so if the world is full of these quasi-objects, these hybrids, and our modern way of thinking tries to hide the mixing, the translation through this performance of purification, how do we actually get out of this bind? How can we think about and analyze the world more effectively?
Well, Latour's proposal is quite radical. It's about moving beyond the dualism altogether, leaving behind that fundamental split between nature and society.
So embrace the hybrids.
Fully embrace the reality of quasi-objects. Remember, they are simultaneously real, like natural things, collective, like social agreements, and discursive, part of how we talk and represent. They don't fit neatly on either side of the old divide. They live in the networks connecting them.
Okay, but how do we study them then? What's the method?
His key analytical tool is the principle of symmetry. This is crucial for the academic approach he advocates.
Symmetry. Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It means, instead of explaining something by defaulting to either nature, like saying, oh, that technological failure was purely a technical problem, or society, like saying, oh, that scientific consensus is just politics,
Right.
which is the standard asymmetrical modern approach.
Right, picking one side.
Symmetry demands that you use the same analytical tools and vocabulary to describe the contributions of both human and non-human actors, and both the natural and social aspects of a phenomenon. You don't start by assuming one side is the real cause and the other is just context or distortion.
So if we take climate change again, a symmetric approach wouldn't just look at the physics of CO2 or just the politics of denial.
Exactly. It would trace the networks that link the CO2 molecules, the computer models, the ice core data, the scientists writing papers, the politicians making speeches, the corporations lobbying, the activists protesting, the hurricanes intensifying. All of it as an interconnected web of actors, human and non-human, contributing to the phenomenon.
The source mentions a figure showing this, right? Asymmetry jumps to one side or the other. Symmetry follows the links.
Yes, that's the visual idea. And why does it matter? Because refusing to privilege one side from the outset lets you actually see the whole network. You see how reality, whether it's a scientific fact, a new technology, or an environmental crisis, is actively constructed, co-produced by all these different elements working together. And it gives a much richer and arguably more accurate picture.
It sounds like a way to get past those really frustrating arguments where people just shout, it's science, versus it's politics.
Precisely. Latour offers a way to map out how it's both and more, all tangled up together.
Okay, this principle of symmetry for analysis, It feels like it must have implications beyond just academic study. If the world works this way, full of active non-humans shaping our reality alongside us, how does Latour suggest we think about, well, governing ourselves, dealing with things like climate change collectively?
Right. This definitely pushes the analysis towards real-world relevance. And it leads to one of his most famous and maybe most initially startling ideas, the concept of a parliament of things.
A parliament of things. So, like, the Amazon rainforest gets a seat, or a specific virus strain. Is that literal?
Huh. Well, it's generally presented more as a potent metaphor, a thought experiment, rather than a blueprint for immediate political reform.
Okay.
The idea stems directly from the analysis. If non-humans, like the ozone layer reacting to CFCs, or river systems flooding due to land use changes, or AI algorithms shaping social interactions, if these things are not just passive background but active participants, actors that shape our world and demand our attention, often through crises.
Then maybe our political systems need to account for them somehow.
That's the challenge he poses. Our current politics is overwhelmingly human-centric. It assumes only humans have legitimate interests or agency in the political sphere. The Parliament of Things is a provocation to imagine. What would a political process look like that finds ways to represent, to give voice to, or at least seriously account for, the interests, constraints, and agency of the non-human world alongside human concerns?
So deciding on climate policy isn't just a negotiation between human groups with different economic interests. It has to somehow incorporate the reality, the speech, the demands of the climate system itself.
Exactly. How do we build institutions that can actually handle these hybrids, that can mediate effectively between human desires and the complex realities of the natural and technological systems we're entangled with? It's a profound challenge to how we normally think about politics.
Okay, so let's loop back then to the title that frames all this. We have never been modern. After exploring the hybrids, the hidden work of translation, the Boyle and Hobbes example, the idea of symmetry, what's the final takeaway from that statement?
The core argument, made very clearly in the source, is that the whole narrative of modernity, the story that we successfully achieved a clean break, a separation between nature and society, subject and object, science and politics, is basically a myth. A powerful myth, a constitution we enacted, but not an accurate description of reality.
We never actually did it.
We never actually lived it. We were always creating and living among hybrids, always doing the work of translation, even while we were loudly proclaiming the success of purification. The clean separation was the performance, the claim, not the reality.
And he sees this as different from, say, postmodern critiques of modernity.
Yes, he makes a point of distinguishing his view. He suggests that postmodernism often critiques modernity but stays trapped within its basic dualism. For example, it might focus on deconstructing the society side, arguing that scientific claims are just social constructions, that everything is representation.
So it collapses everything onto the society pole.
Often, yes. Which, Latour argues, still implicitly accepts the nature-society divide, just chooses one side. His approach, using symmetry, tries to move beyond that dualism entirely. He's not saying science isn't real or nature doesn't matter. He's showing how nature and society are constantly being made together, co-produced, through these networks of translation. Postmodernism might critique the surface claims of modernity, but Latour wants to get at the underlying engine, the hidden work of mixing that modernity itself denies.
That's a really important distinction.
Yeah,
It's not about denying reality, but seeing how reality is constructed through these complex networks involving all sorts of actors.
Precisely. It's about understanding the entanglement, not just flipping the hierarchy.
Okay, let's try and pull the main threads together from this deep dive. We started with this feeling of overwhelm when facing complex issues, climate, health crises that cross all our usual boundaries. These are Latour's hybrids, or quasi-objects. Then we explored his argument. Modernity claims to separate nature and society, purification, but actually relies on constantly mixing them, translation, hiding this mixing work behind the modern constitution.
Right, the asymmetry.
We saw this vividly in the historical example of Boyle, Hobbes, and the air pump, showing how scientific facts and social order were tangled up right from the start, involving both human witnesses and non-human actors like the pump.
A perfect illustration of translation being denied.
And Latour's response: to move beyond the dualism, using the principle of symmetry, analyzing human and non-human contributions equally, following the network.
Yes, as a critical and academic tool.
And this potentially leads to rethinking our politics, maybe through metaphors like the Parliament of Things, acknowledging non-human agency. Finally, the big claim: we have never been modern?
Right.
because this separation was never truly achieved.
Exactly. And grasping Latour's framework, even just the basics we've touched on, can really shift how you look at complex issues today. It helps you resist those simplistic either explanations, as it's science or politics, nature or culture, and instead encourages you to trace the connections, the networks, the hybrids. It offers a much richer lens for critical thinking.
It definitely feels like it gives you permission, almost, to see the messiness and the connections that our usual ways of thinking tend to filter out, asking different questions about who and what is actually involved in shaping things.
So perhaps a final thought to leave you with, building on the source material. If Latour is right, if we really haven't ever been modern in that separated sense, if we've always lived in a world woven from these intricate networks of humans and non-humans, what does truly acknowledging that entanglement mean for our future? Does recognizing this hybrid reality change how we should study the world, how we should try to govern ourselves, how we should simply live on this planet? Does admitting we were never modern open up new possibilities? Or does it just reveal a challenge far deeper and more complex than we ever imagined?